You know, when I created this channel, I envisioned it as primarily being about horror movies. How's that going? Let me sum up the plot of Halloween. Crazy murder guy breaks out of asylum, puts on mask, does murders. That's 12 movies right there. Not to deny Halloween the credit it's due, the original John Carpenter Halloween from the 70s was definitive to the slasher genre. It feels super cliche when you watch it now because it's the movie that everyone else decided to emulate for decades. Masked killer in the suburbs, sex equals death, final girl. Any slasher trope you can think of was either created by Halloween or popularized by Halloween when it copied it from Black Christmas and Suspiria. And, you know I would never read too much into something, but there seems to be a very strange approach to morality in Halloween, particularly the original and the 2018 reboot. One of the classic critiques of Halloween and slashers in general is the whole sex equals death, the virgin survives thing. It seems to affirm that for women especially, sexuality is something to be punished. It calls to mind eras of censorship codes where so-called deviant behavior could only be depicted if there was a punishment for it. It produces this bizarre feeling when watching the movie of a desire to see sex, to put sex in the movie, but then a feeling of dirtiness that requires you to take what you desire and throw it in the fireplace. Halloween's killer, Michael Myers, has little demonstrated motivation beyond some vague psychosexuality. In the original movie's opener, baby Michael murders his teenage sister, who's all topless and such. His fixation on Jamie Lee Curtis is implied to be because he's projecting whatever he saw in his sister onto her. John Carpenter's response to that reading of the movie as saying sex bad, virginity good, was to assert that Halloween is not meant to be any kind of moral statement. He said that Jamie Lee's virginity is only tied to her survival in the sense of her being sexually frustrated and thus lashing out, stabbing Michael in a way that Carpenter calls phallic. Although Halloween isn't meant to be a morality play, it certainly does have an interesting sense of morality. There's regressive ideas about mental illness on display. Michael Myers and the other patients at his asylum are framed as being like just dangerous by virtue of existing, too dangerous to be allowed to exist in the world. Michael's own doctor says that he gave up on trying to rehabilitate him after a few years and came to the conclusion that he just needs to be locked up forever. He refers to Michael as it and is presented as the person best equipped to fight the immeasurable evil that is Michael Myers. And you might say that's an artifact of a less tolerant time, but the 2018 reboot is no better. At the start, some podcasters, it's a whole thing, don't worry about it, go to meet Michael in the institution, and all the framing of it is like, look how scary this is. Imagine how scary it would be to be in the presence of mentally ill people. Carpenter's depiction of Michael Myers was apparently even inspired by a time that he met a real-life mental patient and thought they were soulless and evil. Now, evil is a word that Halloween gets very caught up in. Michael Myers is evil, not just in the sense of being an evil person, but in being an embodiment of evil. He's repeatedly called a boogeyman. He's often framed as bordering on the superhuman, even in the movies that don't associate him with magic and mysticism. He has strength, resilience, and stamina that push beyond the reasonable, as though he has transcended humanity by accepting the devil's blessing. He can get shot like a bajillion times, and he'll still get up in time to vanish. I've always found the decision to make him a mortal human but frame him as superhuman kind of odd. It's ultimately a movie about the idea of evil. The idea that evil exists and can't be destroyed, can't be stopped in any meaningful way, can only be survived, endured by the lucky few. And isn't that kind of childish? Like, that's a reductive moral framework. There is no such thing as evil. In the real world, people have personalities and free will, and there are factors behind actions, even those that are harmful and or criminal. Deontology is an ideology that exists and is believed in, but to act as though it has any real tangible basis, to act as though evil is measurable and observable, it's the outlook of a child. The thing about fiction, though, is it doesn't have to play by the rules of the real world. A fictional world can play by cut and dry good versus evil morality. A fictional villain doesn't need to be a realized character, and they can just operate on a vague desire to do bad things. It's, not necessarily good writing, but you can do it. The existence of the all-consuming pure evil character in a movie doesn't mean that person exists in real life. And nobody really believes a person like that could really exist, right? Right? Well, that's the thing. Some people really do seem to think that people like Michael Myers exist, people whose entire purpose in life is to harm others. And when you consider that that perspective exists, some political arguments start to make more sense. For example, arguments in favor of torture, prison cruelty, the death penalty, and so on make more sense when you consider that the people making these arguments regard the subjects not as humans with motivations, backgrounds, and complexities, but rather as faceless masked killers who are compassionless, violent, and evil. Halloween 2018 was a fine reboot. It had some good scares, it did something interesting by characterizing Jamie Lee Curtis's Laurie as traumatized by the events of the original movie, showing how she has receded from the world and become something akin to a doomsday prepper, how her family looks down on her as a result. She's a really interesting character. But then of course Michael Myers does come back, and he does go after her and attack her, and her aggression is almost valorized. Laurie seems to be going somewhere interesting. She's a person with trauma who needs support and healing, who is constantly in fear of the imagined shadow, but because the plot naturally goes in the direction a slasher reboot has to, the shadow is real. And the ones who thought that Laurie needed to heal were the fools. The arming herself and fitting her house with traps and teaching her daughter to shoot from an early age, these were all the right things to do because there really is a faceless wraith waiting to knock down her door and kill her for no reason. And that is why conservatives liked the movie. They took it as a reification of gun ownership and standing your ground and protecting the homestead. For the National Review, Kyle Smith wrote a piece called A Right-Wing Halloween, praising the movie's politics, which he calls a conservative manifesto, with lines like evil should face condemnation, not sympathy, and lauding doomsday prepper Laurie as the individual correcting the failures of the state. Don't take this as me saying that liking the movie is inherently conservative, or that only conservatives like it, or that the perceived right-wing messaging is the only reason anyone would like the movie. Don't even take this as me saying that the messages were intended to be there. What I am saying is that these messages are not very hard to conjure. These attitudes kind of persist in the sequel Halloween Kills, but get a little bit murkier. First, I just need to get this off my chest. Halloween Kills is such a bad movie. Not even so bad it's funny, just so bad it's painful. Like, an hour in, you're still waiting for the movie to start. It banks entirely on references to the original movie. Virtually every scene has some kind of callback. It's this completely shallow self-reference. There's a bit where this cop guy talks about how in the aftermath of the original movie, he convinced the doctor to not, extrajudicially execute Michael Myers. And he says it like, I was naive and foolish back then. Now I've matured. I believe the boogeyman is real. Now, am I crazy, or is that sentiment just completely detached from reality? It goes for this mob justice angle where a bunch of randos who don't really know what they're doing gang up to try to kill Michael, and they see this like 5-foot-tall Danny DeVito guy who is also an asylum escapee, but not like an evil one, and they go, oh yeah, that's totally Michael Myers, right? And they chase after him until he kills himself, and it's all like, OMG, so sad, he shouldn't have died, mob justice is bad. And the mob thing itself is just so politically numb. You could interpret it as being right-wing groundstanders or any manner of leftist protesters. It's just a vague, anodyne, apolitical sentiment of, you guys don't do bad things. And now Halloween Kills just becomes the kind of movie that pisses everybody off. There's a scene where the mob gangs up on the real Michael and they beat him up a bunch, and he seems to be dead to anyone who doesn't know that the threequel was already in production. But then, oh my god, Michael gets up and starts killing everyone that was trying to kill him because he's just so epic and powerful and evil. You can't kill evil. There is a vague and brief rumination on the idea that Michael has transcended his physical existence, that he is most dangerous as a boogeyman, as a phantasmal idea, and it's maybe the closest I've seen any slasher movie come to delivering outright moral commandments, but it doesn't ultimately go anywhere with it or present an alternative perspective. But going back to the idea of evil, at a certain point the logic gets circular. I think that Halloween and movies like it are maybe partially responsible for the belief that people like Michael Myers exist. I'm not saying that Halloween invented the notion of evil or anything, but it perpetuates it. Another trope that Halloween codified was the subversion of the safety of suburbia. The idea there is that the suburbs are seen as these charming little crime-free utopias, the classic Walton's Americana, and Halloween shakes it up, betrays the feeling of safety in a way that makes people who can relate to living in the suburbs regard their home turf in a new light. It's a dark escapism, one where the fantasy is of victimhood, a morbid tangent where you can imagine the fear of what it would be like if your invincible homestead were breached. There's nothing wrong with that kind of escapism. Most, if not all, horror relies on the consumer being able to relate the fictional situation to themselves in order to find something to be scared by, even if the relation is as simple as, I sure wouldn't want that to happen to me. What is a problem is the real moral panics of suburbia, the real fears around imagined Kabbalistic cults of murderers, the killer around the corner, the pushback whenever a shelter or an SIS opens in a neighborhood whose residents fear the specter of the crime they're sure will follow. So does Halloween actually actively perpetuate these ideas? Or is it more likely that it reacts to them, capitalizes on them? I don't believe in media as causation. Though I find the ethical structure of Halloween fascinating both on its own and in relation to real tautologies, I'm not going to pretend that anyone is waiting for a slasher movie to tell them what's right and what's wrong. The content of these movies might reaffirm things you already believe, but I struggle to imagine what kind of person would have beliefs flat out implanted by them. The most I might say is they could provide fears that may integrate with beliefs already formed or play a part in beliefs later to be formed, because fear isn't always rational, right? If Halloween really does have any power like that, would that be its own fault? Or would it be the fault of whatever status quo would allow mass media to approximate pedagogical authority?